CAC is what it is, and you can optimize it, but often it's sort of hard to change the CAC within the selling into the enterprise. And you have some of these amazing tools that create these great wedges and great killer propositions to begin with. And some companies' CAC is sort of quite minimal. What you want to optimize is LTV and lifetime value. And you can look at this, and really the drivers behind that are really churn and willingness to spend on a monthly basis. And so if you can have a client who is paying you whatever, $1,000 a month, 1 month, the next year they're paying you $1,500 or $2,000 and is growing and growing over time, and they're using more tools within your portfolio, you have just a wonderful business. Some of the best companies have this profile of net revenue retention and growing LTV, and they become super valuable business. The third trend is that the cost to deploy software is coming down rapidly. We've all seen this, whether it's Lovable, Curse, and many others, the cost is coming down. And so the ability to add incremental products and services into your platform is a lot easier than it used to be. And there was a point of view in Silicon Valley. And I remember talking to the investors sort of 15, 20 years ago, and you want to be a single product company. And I think that's just not true anymore. Yes, you want to start with a singular breakthrough product experience because you need to focus as a small startup to get that product market fit. And once you've got that product market fit, you can start to expand out. That's how we think about these stackable business models.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Boundaryless Conversations podcast. This podcast explores the future of business models, organizations, markets, and society in our rapidly changing world. I'm joined today by my usual co-host, Shruti Prakash. Hello, Shruti.
Hello, everybody.
And we are thrilled to welcome our guest today, Pete Flint, a true pioneer in the world of digital marketplaces. Pete is a seasoned entrepreneur and a world-renowned and respected investor, I would say. Pete is a general partner at NFX, which is an early-stage venture firm known for its focus on network effects and marketplaces. Before that, Pete was the founder and CEO of Trulia, among other things, which he led through growth, IPO, and eventually a merger with Zillow. Pete's deep expertise spans from scaling digital platforms to backing the next generation of founders. And he's also been at the forefront of understanding how network effects really evolve into this changing technological landscape, sharing constantly incredible deep advice on NFX blog. Pete, it's an absolute honor to have you here today and to learn from you directly with our community. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Pete, so one thing that really stood out to me in your recent writing is that while much of the industry still seems to consider Gen AI as a mere optimization engine, let's say, you seem to be among the few that really acknowledge that AI will deeply transform how value is created and captured and defended in the marketplace industry. A few months ago, I was struck by one of the pieces you wrote, the one on stackable business models, also because it really resonated with something that we at Boundaryless were already looking into, the evolution from single products into portfolios and generally the need for startups as well to be able to differentiate, create modular go-to-market strategies, products. And this really resonated with AI, right? Because Gen AI seems to emerge as some sort of universal duct tape that can patch everything together. So in the following months from the essay and the other things that you wrote and the startups you invested in, how is your thinking evolved and where are you at the moment in the understanding of how the industry is going?
Well, there's a lot there and a lot has changed in the last couple of months, as you say.
Right.
I guess the sort of thesis behind this sort of stackable business model is coming from a couple of different directions. So firstly, you can look at it from the user perspective. And I think that users are just astounded by the number of tools out there that are leveraging AI to do different functions within their personal life and then also within their business work. The power of those tools is just sort of increasing exponentially. The real challenge for a lot of them is the usability integration between those platforms. So we see things like MCP and other APIs and other tools that are sort of making it easier to integrate. But realistically, it's like you, particularly for the kind of like SMB market, you really care about ease of use primarily. And differentiate between like one AI model versus the other is becoming sort of less distinguishable. So in that environment, you actually just, if you had one tool to perform multiple functions with a great user interface, you'll be very sticky to that. And that's what you want. You don't want to switch between, we've all seen it in sort of call centers and others, they're flipping between their kind of Salesforce screen and their kind of like internal system. And it's a nightmare. It's complicated. So we see just this user experience, which is sort of integrating lots of tools. You can look at it from another vector, which is the enterprise perspective and the company, the startup perspective. What they, in the economics, I put my investor hat on and just say, okay, what do we look for in terms of when we see stuff? And we see CAC is what it is, and you can optimize it, but often it's sort of hard to change the CAC within the selling into the enterprise. And you have some of these amazing tools that create these great wedges and great killer propositions to begin with. And so some companies' CAC is sort of quite minimal. What you want to optimize is LTV and lifetime value. And you can look at this and really the drivers behind that are really churn and willingness to spend on a monthly basis. And so if you can have a client who they're paying you whatever, $1,000 a month, 1 month, the next year they're paying you $1,500 or $2,000 and is growing and growing over time, and they're using more tools within your portfolio, you have just a wonderful business that your kind of net revenue retention is going up, your LTV is going up. Some of the best companies have this profile of net revenue retention and growing LTV, and they become super valuable business. So, we think about stackable business models, that kind of what we think about. And perhaps the third trend is that the cost to deploy software is coming down rapidly. We've all seen this, whether it's Lovable, Curse, and many others, the cost is coming down. And so the ability to add incremental products and services into your platform is a lot easier than it used to be. And there was a point of view in Silicon Valley. I remember talking to the investors sort of 15, 20 years ago, and you want to be a single product company. In the sort of early Steve Jobs kind of mandating, okay, let's rationalize our product line, single product company, or at least minimal product company. And I think that's just not true anymore. I think it's about, yes, you want to start with a singular breakthrough product experience because you need to focus as a small startup to get that product market fit. And once you've got that product market fit, you can start to expand out. That's how we think about these stackable business models. And in a world of AI, it's very hard to predict the future, right? And it's really hard to kind of know, okay, what's the future going to bring? And is my tool today just going to become obsolete in 2 years' time? The principal kind of focus for us as a firm is how do you build network effects into that? How do you build defensibility through network effects and using data? And that often requires a level of scale that's important. So that's a primary focus when we think about defensibility. But there's also defensibility in the form of embedding in organizations. And if you can provide multiple tools and multiple functions and start to kind of provide a lot of utility into organizations, then you have this embedding in an organization, which makes you very sticky and very hard to rip out. And even if there might be an incrementally better tool that launches by some new startup a year from now, you've got the head start, you've got the embedding, you've got the client loyalty. You become less displaceable once you've got a lot of data and utility within that organization.
When you, let's say, start talking about stackable business models, easy relation or correlation that people can make is to the idea of building super apps, right? Essentially, which was what was happening before. But these two are fundamentally sort of different in my understanding, that one is sort of core asset based and then ancillary sort of stacks that are built on top of it, versus the other, which just has a bunch of varied features that are offered to a customer. So do you think they're in that, let's say, stackable models are new ways or new forms of a super app that is built on the infrastructure layer essentially? And if not, then how is it different? How is it more defensible? How is it a moat that organizations can have in-house? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you don't need to be too scientific on this. And I think I agree that the sort of a collection of tools may not be that defensible as opposed to a sort of integrated platform. Some of the things that we would look for is like, where is the customer pool? It may be that there's an important problem that you are able to solve for that user quite uniquely, that they're pulling in that direction. That can be a path and should be a path that users go down. More optimally, we look for something as you think about following typically the customer journey in an experience. And you ideally want to start early on in that customer journey. And so you have the right to play in the subsequent pieces of that journey. I started a company called Trulia. And so we started in the home buying area. And you can easily see in that environment, okay, you start in the home buying area, then that leads into the mortgage process. And, that goes into the maintenance process and upkeep, moving's in there somewhere. And then the selling process as well, many years later. And so being early on in that customer journey is really beneficial and gives you the right to play in those subsequent journeys.
You said something that made me think about the spectrum that seems to be emerging, right? And when I say a spectrum, I mean, when you answered the first question, Peter, you made an interesting point and I think a key point that customers are looking for a certain experience. You start from using a piece of software, right? As a user, what is the landscape that we can imagine happening in the coming years? So some people are advocating for what they call agent marketplaces, right? So essentially, since you cannot have maybe one product that does everything, how, as a user, can I integrate this product? And I can do that maybe self-developing the integration, so reclaiming, let's say, the power of integrating tools. So maybe in this case, the AI, Gen AI, can play this middleware role, no? This capability for companies to be more on top of the choices, no? To regain choices in terms of how they create their workflows, how they integrate the tools that they use. Then there is the agent marketplace, where maybe we can imagine that there is some sort of common elements across the several type of products that the company uses, like a Hugging Face or something like that. Finally, there is potentially this trajectory where you said also it's becoming very cheap and easy to expand your software into other things, and this super app trajectory that Shirley was talking about. So imagining that we have a user in the center that uses a certain piece of software, we can see these three potential directions, right? Either the company regains total control and they integrate software and tools through the use of AI. Either we go into agent marketplaces or we go into this super app perspective where maybe one vendor can expand gradually into many other layers in the value chain. In this spectrum, in this radar, let's say, where do you find yourself? And I appreciate you say there's no recipe, we have to see, but what's your feeling? Where are we most likely to evolve into?
I don't have sort of precision on it because it's sort of going very quickly. I think a lot of it is probably, firstly, I think you're going to see all of the above. But I think what you will see is going to be different at different customer types. If you are, let's say, a large enterprise, you probably have like a team on board which is able to kind of build proprietary agents, license third-party agents, integrate those agents into a platform, and you perhaps less care about user experience, you more care about performance and sort of proprietary data and edge against. You can imagine, if you're Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan building kind of, financial agents, you're going to leverage third-party stuff. You're going to build a lot of stuff in-house and you're not going to share your data. And so that will kind of lead itself to perhaps you will license the software, but you will not license the service offering itself and share your data. And then you can think about the local coffee shop, which is going to be like, okay, I want someone to help me with my procurement and knowing kind of how many coffee beans I should buy in the next month. They could even have a point of view on like, okay, a coffee bean price is going up or down, and should I kind of buy the next 6 months now, and so, or should I finance that? All these sort of things. Agents are becoming more available, and you're like, just do it for me, because I'm busy in my coffee shop, and I don't. And sure, you can take all my historical sales data, and you can take all this, because I just really caring about cheapest price, lowest friction service offering. And in that case, and you probably don't want to have accounting different from procurement, different from something else. You probably want a sort of a more super app type environment. And so you're going to see the sort of spectrum between those different dimensions, I suspect.
So depending on the intensity, let's say, of the differentiation you have to create on the market, you may have to spend more effort, energy, and intellect in creating your own stuff versus...
Yeah, I think it's sort of, what are you optimizing for? Is it sort of convenience and price, or is it security, proprietary performance? There is a question around like an agent marketplace. Is that sort of a realistic idea? And it sort of seems like, you think of marketplaces and you think of agents. It's not totally clear on my mind whether that's going to be a thing. You can see MCP platforms that kind of facilitate that. But I think it's, if agents are just software, you will, see things like Hugging Face that work. You will see kind of other platforms, GitHub and other, which are sort of social software repositories. But I don't know if you'll see kind of real-time agent marketplaces. I don't know if we'll see that, just because I think companies will want to kind of integrate this performance reasons into their service. And I think this stuff is, the cost to create agents is going to go down very, very, today it feels like some sort of special sauce, but I think that the cost to create these agents is going to go rapidly down.
I also find very fascinating the topic on agents, marketplaces, and more generally how agents are going to revamp the concept of user experience from the ground up, right? Because it's not just that you move from interacting with UI, traditional UI, into interacting with the chat. Is that moving from API-based, for example, integration into agent-mediated integrations is such a deep transformative change in how we experience software, because it moves from deterministic interactions with computers into undeterministic ones. So basically you move from interacting with rules into interacting with something that can have a nuance and opinions, let's say, right? So it's really a fascinating perspective. Maybe you have encountered some pioneering startups that are exploring this space. What is your impression into this major change in user experience? Because you also brought up user experience as a major point of defensibility, right?
The ability for AI to drive personalized user experience is radical. You see it first and foremost in the financial performance of Meta and others, which are just creating very personalized ads. That's a very hard problem. Almost the sort of genesis behind Llama and the investment from Meta in AI. I mean, that's a fairly sort of easily understandable use case. But when you think about user experiences in vertical services, whether that's traditional marketplaces that we might be familiar or kind of enterprise work use cases, then you start to build kind of more radical product experiences. At the end of the day, the underlying sort of challenge and opportunity is around the data and your ability to kind of like access that data. Less about necessarily understanding that data, because that's so many powerful models that can understand and interpret that data. But it's really, a basic LLM is really a sort of probability score on what the next word is, the large language model. And that works kind of well in that and understood and appreciated in a chat experience. But you can apply that kind of next action into other things as well. And personalized user experiences, that can manifest itself in everything from sort of simple product recommendations to generative user experiences and generative UI. And we can certainly see this path to providing user experience. But at the end of the day, it's having access to the data. And so whether that is product data, ERP data, website data, and it's a company's ability to kind of access that data and make that accessible to these large language models, you're going to see some companies figure it out, and it's going to drive sort of remarkable performance in their product experience and in their workflows. You can imagine you pick up the phone and you're phoning a call center about some particular problem, and it will say, "Oh, Mr. Flint, I hear you're struggling to book a flight to London. We've looked into it, and here's what we can do." Because they've seen my activity on the website, and there's an LLM which is live streaming information from my website activity through to the call center. I see you're researching some product to purchase. They know your entire purchase history. There's a whole bunch of things that you could see drive kind of massive, revenue upside as well as cost reduction opportunities.
I wanted to touch on a more sort of larger topic, I guess, because I think something you have strongly advocated for is network effects as a topic, right? So for me, I'm curious if we can touch down on that a bit more, see how that changes with our time, with more decentralization, with, let's say, AI getting more commoditized, like a user switching cost is getting even lower. So one, is it still as simple as saying, network effects is more customers means more value? Or is it about extracting more value from the existing or single customers? How is that sort of network effect changing in this time?
The sort of principle of network effects is that a product or service becomes more valuable the more people use that product or service, or more valuable, more useful. I think the reality in this AI world is that you can provide an enormous amount of utility very quickly without having any incremental users, because it's the LLMs have done all the work in the background with data to provide that experience. And so you see dozens of companies providing great user experience with limited network effects and growing incredibly quickly. And you'll say, well, there's no network effects in this business, but it's like a super sort of impressive business. And I think it's fun, which likes network effects. We kind of have to be mindful of that we're kind of not, well, where are the network effects? And you can get significant scale very quickly with these services. That said, this space is moving so quickly, and there's so many smart, talented people and so much capital going after any idea that catches fire. And you see whether it's like AI SDRs and being a sort of or kind of like AI call centers, they're all just like racing to, okay, that's a good idea. I can build that very quickly. And so you're in this environment where you have multiple companies with multiple talented teams going after similar ideas and also doing great. The question comes like, well, which one is going to be the kind of the winning one? And you could look at, well, these are great companies. There's no network effects, but they're doing great because they're providing real utility. But there will come a point, well, how do we compete against these kind of myriad of competitors out there? And I think at that point, they're going to be like, okay, well, we need some defensibility here because there are all these competitors going after it. And so the classic enterprise use case, if I take these sort of AI SDRs or customer service, okay, we need to build some sort of like platform network effect or app store within that so that I can integrate into kind of like 50 different platforms to give me more data in to provide that. So I kind of provide a better service and integration. The other defensibilities around embedding that's relevant for here, like how do I embed myself in this user experience to make it easy to transition and integrate into the platform? And once it's integrated, it's more sticky. I think we are very open-minded about companies that don't have a network effect at this point. And I think it's, in some ways, you may not need a network effect to build a good starting point. But ultimately, I think any good business is going to get massively competitive, and they need to have a point of view about how I add that defensibility over time. Otherwise, they're just going to be outcompeted by some other company over time.
It's really fascinating to see how all these trends are kind of pushing into mechanism of, for example, if you look into the market, how is it shrinking into smaller niches, shrinking into faster cycles. So it's really something that is challenging to the very idea of building a defensible business, right? So building a defensible business is really about, kind of trying to defend your position and scale. So scale versus niches and defensible business long term versus short term. So I think this is really challenging from the perspective of the product designer, the company, the startup. So you also mentioned this very interesting idea of generative UX, mentioning that we may look into a future where users receive experiences that are fully personalized. What are the other bigger changes that you can see from the perspective of the user? So what is your perception in terms of what the users will expect from products moving forward, maybe both in consumer and business, but of course, these things may be different, but maybe there could be some sort of convergence in terms of expectations.
Look, if you take the long-term view here, if you think about consumers or workplace, you can sort of go back and imagine these sort of visions of like the 1950s office, or even kind of industrial revolution factories. There's a lot of equipment, right? And my desk or a person's desk sort of 30 years ago, there's a fax machine, there's a printer, there's a computer, there's a Rolodex, there's a phone, and they have all this stuff. And over the last several decades, you've seen just the reduction in the amount of stuff. And essentially, technology is becoming invisible. It's becoming less prevalent and kind of more invisible in our day-to-day lives, whether that's in our home or in our workplace. It's becoming more persistent, but it's becoming more invisible. And I think probably the same thing is going to be the case going forward. You can imagine voice interfaces are fascinating. You see the Meta Ray-Bans. I think they're adding screens in the near future. And you start to see this stuff becoming sort of more kind of ambient and pervasive rather stuff. And so that, that's, and how that will manifest itself is from personalized recommendations, less web browsing, I suspect. You'll be able to have agents that will, if I'm looking for flights or houses, you'll be notified by them and you'll be able to speak to computers, much like you'd speak to a real human. That's probably the more kind of obvious way things will go. And I could see that certainly from consumer perspective. I think kind of voice agents are very interesting. I think in the enterprise, I think you're going to see just a large elements of autonomy going into in these organizations. And so functions will be replaced, just like you've seen in factories or typing pools that would happen. People who were typing things just got replaced by computers. So if you stretch and think functions will start to be automated, you could imagine these very small teams doing large amounts of autonomous work. And the agents will speak to each other, which will create a kind of further flywheel of speed. And I don't know exactly what that will look like, but I think it's potentially quite a sort of radical change in the way that things will evolve. And when you have computers talking to other computers, the interaction cost goes down radically.
And we are seeing already, right, the contracting, autonomous contracting, for example. And I was thinking, while you were mentioning this distribution of autonomy in the organization, which is something that we also not only see, but actually support with our frameworks, right? Decentralized teams, units. This really also changes all the purchasing and acquisition for software and solutions. So if we think about enterprise software, what happens to enterprise software in this landscape? It's completely changed the landscape, right?
Yeah, I think it will change. I think there will be a period of change that some of the incumbents will embrace and say, well, okay, my just being Salesforce is not sufficient anymore. I need to provide additional layers of services on top of that. The basic functionality is commoditized, and I need to move up the stack, essentially, to provide further value that the customers want. Or there'll be companies and they may need to adjust their pricing models to accommodate this change. Or there'll be other companies that aren't able to make that transition, and they're going to be becoming less relevant over time. And of course, this is just what we've seen, in technology over the last 30, 40 years or longer. So companies didn't make the shift to mobile. Companies didn't make the shift to SaaS, didn't make the shift to personal computing. And some do, and then some don't. And that creates a real opportunity for startups. And we are absolutely seeing an inflection point. which I think a lot of the incumbents are very aware of. But as always, some of them will be able to execute on it, and some of them won't. But probably more importantly for startups is that the ability, there will be new markets formed that were previously unaddressable. There are no incumbents going after them. New markets in the form of, just like in mobile, we saw things like Uber being created in a mobile environment which just could not exist. There'll be other examples where things are just, in this AI world, things just couldn't exist before.
I'm curious, how do, let's say, founders prepare for all of this? Because you were speaking about building invisible technology, and there is so much more control and power that is sort of passed on to a consumer in their sort of need also for extreme personalization. They are, I would say, increasingly impatient and sort of have a higher control on what they can demand and at an easier switching cost like before, and also expecting zero friction and so on. So, how can a founder prepare their organizations for this? What, I don't know, precautionary steps can they take? When do they look at stackability and so on?
Probably the two big things that I would be encouraging teams to think about. One is to have really high precision on your entry point into a category. And we've just seen that, and it may not happen day one, but just like really early on, find out where the super valuable entry point is into a category, into a business, into a service. And that may be in terms of the sort of ICP, whether you're going sort of bottoms up or going tops down, what is a specific use case. That finding that great initial entry point makes life so much easier later on. And you see companies that sort of get it wrong and it sort of kills them because they're not able to access it. I wrote a piece not long ago called Killer Wedges, which is really about this principle of like, what is your wedge into a market? So hard for startups to win. And if you pick that right entry point, it absolutely gives you either sort of an unfair economic advantage, where this is the sort of profit pool. You can imagine Tesla going after sort of high margin sports cars. Great wedge into kind of launching the Model 3 a decade or so later. Or kind of Uber going after black cars, less price sensitive, cash rich, time poor customers, gave them a premium access and a premium margin that enable them to kind of tackle the rest of the market. Or it can mean, like we talked about earlier, around, okay, this is your entry point, and there are many subsequent revenue opportunities further down the line that I can tap into once I've got this initial entry point. So that's kind of number one, to be really thoughtful about that entry point. The other is just being fast. I think it's sort of simple and obvious, but often the fastest teams are the winning teams. We like to say that anyone can beat a grandmaster at chess if you move 2 moves for their 1. We've seen just the fastest teams win the market. They're not the smartest teams. They haven't got to raise enough money. They haven't raised more money, but they're just moving fast. And that's an organizational design. That's a cultural thing within startups. And we don't know what the future is. I think the future's changed significantly in the last 3 years. And it's going to change probably more so in the next 3 years. You can't necessarily predict the future, but if you're just moving incredibly quickly to invent the future and you're listening to customers, you're shipping very quickly, then you have the opportunity to win. At the earlier stage, I've optimized for those two things.
Even the last point that you just made about being fast, it's a testament to how much the market has changed, right? It's much more about being less strategic, more tactical in terms of catching opportunities, diversifying, so being ready to spin out new products that can conquer some, the niche where there's availability. So I think this is a very strong message to founders to not overthink, execute, be lean, have lean teams, necessarily learn to leverage on these AI technologies that can make it easier for you to prototype and get into new markets, which is, I think, all these things also are will encounter certain resistance. Because, for example, last week I was talking to a developer and he was telling me, it's nice to have Gen AI capabilities, but the quality is not there. You have to refactor and so on. But I guess we will get into a place where you have to be so fast that you will have to think about refactoring your product later on, and maybe first validate the business opportunity with clunky technical solution that maybe will be masked by an excellent chat interface that will interact with your customer. So I'm wondering if in these times, does it even make sense to try to predict what's going to happen? What's your feeling, Peter? Does it even make sense to start developing this muscle, or much better to be fast? And
well, I think I think you have to have a vision of the future.
Right.
You have to know which direction you're going. Otherwise, every direction feels like the right direction. So have I think, a very explicit vision of the future and kind of what you're intending to achieve, but be quite ambiguous about the path there. I was talking to my partner James yesterday, and we met a team that was sort of on paper brilliant. And they were kind of the highest academic schools, kind of in here, and these great schools. One of the concerns is that they have been experts at being right, not necessarily experts at being fast. And there's no prizes for being right. The prize is about kind of like building these things and being really, really quick. And I think, of course, if you're right and fast, that's the holy grail, right? But if you are right but slow, you lose. And so I would absolutely optimize for that speed. So, and be sort of quite ambiguous. And if you have 90% confidence that this is the right path, then that's good enough to ship things very quickly. And that there's a sort of internal discipline in teams, not to get bogged down by that stuff, and to be okay with ambiguity and not sacrificing the speed of execution is such a critical skill. And it gets harder, as you kind of think about large organizations and think about their kind of, I'm a director at this company, I want to become a VP. I don't want to screw up. I'm worried about kind of my reputation. You're worried about making mistakes. And when you're a small 3-person team, it may not matter because everyone's got each other back. But when you become a big organization, so and there were great leaders at big companies that encourage people to embrace failure, but it's sometimes hard as you get bigger. But I think that kind of DNA of focus on speed, experimentation, failure is never good, but at least to be rewarding experimentation, appreciating failure as part of the process.
I think it's a testament to the rate of change that we had James last year in the podcast. I think it was the last episode or so. And he was making the point that Gen AI was opening an opportunity for incumbents. Now we are discussing the topic and we are seeing, a different trend, right? We are seeing the trend that tells you, you need to be fast, you need to be okay with clunky solutions. And so it's a little bit changing the narrative. So again, it's a testament on how fast things are changing in this landscape. So thank you again.
There was this techie who moved from Singapore to India because it got really popular and viral. So he said he wants to expose his kids to chaos so that they know how to manage life better. And he literally moved with his entire family because he said Singapore is, let's say, way too perfect and sort of systemized in that sense. So it reminded me when you spoke about, having a team which is extremely successful in certain ways, but hasn't faced, let's say, challenges and so on.
And just on that point, I think it's on location, that's a sort of family thing. We're in Silicon Valley in San Francisco, and I think, and speed is a function of often information and culture. If you're in an organization where you're kind of encouraging people to move quickly and make mistakes, but also you have access to all the information to make the best decisions, that's valuable. If you expand that from a company to a city, you look at a city like San Francisco, where it's saturated by founders and engineers that have access to information, and there are informal kind of information flows between people, whether that's professionally or socially, which gives incremental advantages to kind of execution. You hear on the grapevine, I did this thing implemented this with this AI agent, and that gives a marginal edge, which those marginal edges compound over time. Similarly, you see a culture where there is a very strong work ethic from a bunch of people, a culture of kind of like, how do I achieve and succeed at startup success, which it's not everyone's cup of tea, but it's that culture creates incremental speed boosts, which for many companies can be the difference between kind of success and failure.
Towards the end of our podcast, we have this section called as the Breadcrumbs, where we ask you to share some inspiration that our listeners can, gain something from. So maybe books, podcasts, anything that has sort of shaped your journey that would really help.
I haven't read that many books recently, but I do listen to a lot of podcasts. I actually have been listening to this, the Diary of the CEO that's been going on, and I recently discovered it, but it's a kind of a big thing. It's very interesting. And it's more about kind of like mental health and kind of personal well-being necessarily than kind of business insights. But I found that just a really fascinating thing on my commutes and journeys in, just beyond the kind of like, the sort of echo chamber of kind of tech stuff. So that's probably, I've enjoyed that actually. That's been an interesting one for me.
Thank you. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you so much, Pete. It's been beyond interesting, but also a good recognition that we don't have an easy answer in this moment. Neither as developers, product developers, startuppers, or investors, or entrepreneurs, and incumbents, operators. Nobody understands what's really happening, and I feel it fascinating that very often we seem to be much convinced of the power that these technologies give to the supply side of the market, but on the consumer side, on the user side, we're really confused on how these user experiences are going to change. I think this is the most important piece in my mind at the moment, is really trying to figure out what does it mean for users, and not just in terms of experience, but also in terms of priorities and value that the customers will see, recognize in the products. So again, thank you for being available for challenging conversations at the start of your morning, which is also a good exercise for the brain. So I'm sure that today you will have a very creative day, because you trained your mind so early in the morning in challenging questions. So thank you. Thanks again. It was a pleasure to have you. I hope you also enjoyed a bit the conversation.
Very much so. Yeah, it was great. Great to catch up. Great conversation.
Thank you so much, Shruti, for the always great questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Pete. And thanks, Simone.
And for our listeners, as always, if you head to www.boundareless.io/resources/podcast, you will find Pete's interview with the transcript and all the things that he mentioned. Until we speak again, remember to think boundaryless.